Dear guests, here at our office in DC and as well as at your screens, welcome. This is a hybrid event, and we're happy that so many people just are joining us from all across the United States and from across the Atlantic. I understand that last count was over 70 online participants. So good afternoon to everybody in the US, and I guess good evening to everybody on the other side of the Atlantic. My name is Christian Hähne. I am president and CEO of American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We're an American 501c3 and the professional partner of the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. The Humboldt Foundation promotes global exchange and collaboration of scientists and researchers. There are 30,000 alumni of Humboldt Fellowship programs, 30,000 Humboldtians worldwide, about 6,000 in the United States alone. Thousands of great minds and influential voices in various fields. Alexander von Humboldt did not believe in borders, neither between nations nor between disciplines. This is reflected in the academic, the professional, and the geographic diversity of the Humboldt network. Humboldtians are our biggest asset in putting together transatlantic programs with which we're trying to contribute to tackling the most pressing challenges our societies are facing on either side of the Atlantic and worldwide. Challenges such as global warming, energy security, AI governance, public health, you name it. Alexander von Humboldt is at the center of our brand. With our new perspectives on Humboldt series, we want to provide somewhat fresh perspectives on the historical figure, his work, and his achievements. The idea is to put a spotlight on aspects of Humboldt's legacy that are not too well known yet. Something along the lines of what you did not know about Alexander von Humboldt yet and why it matters today. We're very happy and honored to have Andreas Daum as our speaker today. Andreas Daum is a professor of history at the State University of New York at Buffalo and a recipient of the Humboldt Research Prize. You are a Humboldtian. Thank you so much for being with us today, Andreas. Andy's research interests include German, European, and transatlantic history from the 18th to the 20th century, the history of science and knowledge, the history of historiography, and immigration after 1933. Andreas received his BA from the University of Cologne in 1985 and his PhD, summa cum laude, from Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität Munich in 1995. He was a Baird Society resident fellow at the Smithsonian Institution in 2017 and received a research fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities from 2014 to 2015. He has spent time at Harvard and the German Historical Institute around the corner here near DuPont Circle and received the Meyerson Award for Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching and Mentoring in 2024. And the English edition of his newest book, Alexander von Humboldt, a concise biography, was published by Princeton University Press just very recently, this October. And there is a number of copies here at our office, and I encourage everybody following us online. It's out there, that great book now. You can order it and read it today. It's worth it, very worth it. When Andreas told me first about the question he wants to tackle with his talk today, I was immediately thrilled. The title, How Humboldtian Was Alexander von Humboldt? I'd say that is a pretty provocative question, a pretty new perspective. After all, we're always feeding the narrative about everything Humboldtian, praising the value of Humboldtian, being a benchmark for the quality of science and for the brilliance of scientists. And now, Andreas seems to want to explain to us that the one person who was not really Humboldtian was Humboldt himself. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Andy. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. I encourage everybody to ask questions, make comments. It's possible for those of you here at our office, as well as for viewers online. You can use the chat option for that. This event is made possible in part by the generous contributions of our donors, including Cosmos Circle members, sustaining supporters who give monthly, annually, or biannually to empower American Friends programming. Today is Giving Tuesday, and we're setting a bold goal to add 10 new Cosmos Circle members by midnight to ensure we can continue hosting programs like today's speaker series. Your support helps fund cultural connections and meaningful collaborations. Scan the QR code on the postcards that we have here on at the office. And for our virtual attendees, you may click the link in the chat to become a Cosmos Circle member or make a one-time donation. Every gift, big or small, helps us reach our goal and supports the program and the programs that make a difference. But now, the main event, how Humboldtian was Alexander von Humboldt. Andy, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So, good afternoon, and thank you, Chris, very much for this generous introduction, though I was hoping you would not identify the year I earned my BA. That's 20th century. In any case, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation is a terrific institution, and I'm very, very grateful for the support it has provided me with throughout my career. So a big thank you to the foundation and to Chris and the American Friends here in Washington, and to all of you for coming and for those joining us on Zoom. Humboldt himself will stand in the center of my talk, and I admit the title is curious, if not odd. How could Humboldt have been anything but Humboldtian? Well, research is always about testing assumptions we take for granted. Of course, in all fields of knowledge, we need generalizations, or as the sociologist Max Weber put it, ideal types. They condense the myriad details we research into broader statements. They can capture how the ideas formulated by an individual radiated into society. At the same time, it is worthwhile to ask to what extent ideal types capture individual agency. For example, how much Andrew Jackson is in Jacksonian democracy, the populist concept we associate with the 7th President of the United States. Was Darwinism, popularized by many of his followers, truly what Charles Darwin had in mind? Or can Adolf Hitler and his ideology alone explain how the Nazi regime functioned? For good reasons, historians hardly ever speak of Hitlerism. Against this background, why don't we examine how Humboldtian Alexander von Humboldt was? The images I start with, and I hope on Zoom you can also see the images, illustrate that there may be a difference. First, we see Alexander von Humboldt twice the way we have enshrined him in popular memory. To the left, standing upright as a monument in Philadelphia, towering over us at a mature age, a script in his right hand, the left on the globe. To the right, with similar gestures but remote from mundane life, Humboldt is sitting as a wise old man in front of the Humboldt University in Berlin. In both monuments, Humboldt is settled, calmly looking at a mission accomplished. And that mission, so we read everywhere, was to document minutely, measure accurately, and interpret comprehensively every aspect of nature, from subterranean plants in Franconia to the air quality around volcanic mountains in the Andes. Using precision instruments and generating data were the means to achieve the mission's actual purpose, connecting the dots. Humboldt wanted to synthesize knowledge in a cosmic vision of nature. That is the model historians have summarized for the last 60 years in the term Humboldtian science. Susan F. Cannon, for many years at the Smithsonian Institution here in town, has defined it as the, quote, great new thing in professional science in the first half of the 19th century. The accurate, measured study of widespread but interconnected real phenomena to find a definite law and a dynamic cause, end quote. I want to suggest today that Humboldt, in fact, had a tough time living up to this ideal. He strove for it in the second half of his long life, and you're all familiar with it, 1769 to 1859, but he could never achieve it. A bit of this other Humboldt surfaces in our third image, an 1805 sketch that I used deliberately for the cover of my book. You see a young, handsome Humboldt, not the old wise man. A Humboldt who is curious and almost a bit cocky, unfinished in his work and up for new adventures. More Humboldt than Humboldtian, to push the envelope a little bit, but Chris assured me that the people today in the audience and on Zoom are all very kind and benign, so you will forgive me. Let's take a closer look at Humboldt's early years. It recasts him in a novel way before we take his later years into account. Most Humboldt interpretations have done the opposite. They have interpreted his early years through the lens of his older ones and used the monuments we have preserved until today as a prism. In this view, Humboldt was early on in his way to collecting his thoughts for his magnum opus, fittingly called Cosmos. He was a mastermind in the making. This afternoon, I want to bring Humboldt as a sensitive individual into the picture. I like to examine how his surprising fragility impacted his way of producing knowledge and thus complicates our conventional wisdom. So let's move from the monuments to the Mensch. In fact, in the formative phase of his life, that is during the 30 years before he departed Europe to go on his American journey in 1799, Humboldt's scientific enterprises deviated significantly from what has been retrospectively called Humboldtian science. They were often impromptu, hastily put together, and unprecise. In these early decades, Humboldt's science, as I call it, as opposed to Humboldtian science, was not carefully layered or geared towards a cosmic vision. Instead, it was situational, experimental, emotionally charged, and anything but coherent. Nor was the American journey planned for long. In fact, a year prior to his departure, Humboldt was still thinking of going to Egypt, and Napoleon's wars made this and other planned endeavors impossible. Alexander studies at no less than 4 institutions of higher learning. They are dispersed over the Holy Roman Empire north of the Alps. The University of Frankfurt Oder and Göttingen, the Trade Academy in Hamburg, and the Mining Academy in Saxony Freiburg. A German nation state does not exist yet, nor does a university exist in Berlin, the city where Alexander and his slightly older brother William were born. Nowhere does Humboldt spend more than 2 semesters. Nowhere does he graduate or submit a major thesis. In today's academic world, Humboldt would have spectacularly failed with this record. And in passing, like Charles Darwin, Humboldt never taught at a university either. He even leaves after a few years in 1796, the only nominal job he ever holds, that of a Prussian mining inspector. What is happening? Remember, we are not talking about a wild teenager, but a man until he turns 30. Humboldt is constantly on the move. We are rightly in awe of his American journey and the later excursion into Central Asia in 1829. Yet it is important to realize that Humboldt is relentlessly zigzagging through Europe in the 1790s. This is anything but a gentleman's grand tour through the continent. Humboldt also jumps from one subject to the other. And it is hardly known until today that he is continuously suffering from physical ailments and emotional crises. I brought you two maps, and I'm aware that the script is way too small to read it, but just look at these dots, and this is just a selection, leaving out the villages and the small towns in between. And you see already he's all over in the German language territories in Central Europe and all over Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to France's coast at the English Channel, southern England, northern Italy, the Alps, the Baltic Sea, into Poland, and of course into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Humboldt inspects salt mines in Austria and botanical collections in England. He travels twice through the Rhine Valley, and he ultimately knows the Rhine Valley better than the Orinoco. The man crawls into mine shafts in Prussian territories and climbs alpine mountains in Switzerland. He examines salt mines on the Baltic coast and ventures in today's Czech Republic. Humboldt dissects rats and rabbits with his brother. He discusses anatomical issues with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He undertakes experiments on frog legs with Alessandro Volta in Italy. He catches up on new chemical research in Paris, measures the altitude in various Spanish regions, and writes one report and letter after another. This is quite an astonishing achievement, even for a man who needs only 4 to 5 hours of sleep. And Humboldt measures everything everywhere. Daniel Kehlmann has caricatured this obsession in his best-selling literary novel, Measuring the World. The book, just in parentheses, the book is not very popular among my colleagues, among Humboldt experts, but frankly, I like it a lot, actually. I think it's quite entertaining and brilliantly written, and I don't mind if it kind of belittles the hero a little bit. Humboldt carries instruments wherever he goes in Europe, on the back of a horse, in a carriage, on a boat. No railway system yet. However, his peripatetic style of life and his roaming research come at a considerable cost. The more Humboldt travels, and the more he explores ever new topics, from volcanism and magnetism to ceramics productions, salt mining, and glaciers, the less time he has to document precisely his results, compare them with those of others, read relevant literature, and create reliable data sequences, some of the very preconditions of Humboldtian science as an ideal type. Humboldt does not settle geographically and emotionally. Instead, his life becomes even more hectic as he pours out books that are often immature. Between 1790 and 1799, Humboldt publishes no less than 5 monographs. They remain unread until today and have never been translated into English. And admittedly, one of them is in Latin, so that's for the humanists among you and on Zoom. Still, these books are fascinating in their eclecticism and a testimony to Humboldt's bubbly curiosity and undisciplined, and I mean that in a positive sense, undisciplined intellectual breadth. They are not closed, dry texts. On the contrary, they reveal the author's struggle with securing knowledge and his stirred emotions. These texts are scientific as much as autobiographical pieces. Take the 2 volumes of Humboldt's Experiments on Stimulated Muscle and Nerve Fiber, the most laborious and comprehensive work of his early life. And if you have not read anything by Humboldt so far, my good advice is not to start. With this one, it's really a tough nut to crack. Experiments deal with an issue that late Enlightenment scientists discuss heatedly. Is organic life due to a principle, a vital force, Lebenskraft, which cannot be reduced to the mechanics of organisms? If so, does this vital force work exclusively within matter, or is it infused from outside? An outside force would open the possibility of a divine or other supernatural power. To explore these different options, and with enormous zeal, Humboldt conducts thousands of experiments with living and dead organic matter and inorganic substances, specifically looking for reactions to electric impulses. He even sticks metal wires into his body to trace electric impulses. And I spare you graphic details, so just let your imagination run wild. All this is complicated, time-consuming, and daunting. And Humboldt can only experiment in small intervals over 5 years between his other tasks, and sometimes even during his travels. Accordingly, this book reads like a diary, reflecting the hectic pace of his life. Instead of presenting in true Humboldtian fashion, as we would assume, a coherent summary of his works on nerves and animal electricity, the 2 volumes become a collage of separate research moments with contradictory results. Only at the very end does Humboldt acknowledge that an independent vital force does not exist. Humboldt repeatedly exclaims within the text, so he has this printed, yes, even more, or my students would probably say wow, one wow after the other. So the text itself, the scientific book, registers his enthusiasm about the progress of his research, but also the many moments of frustration in between. This book is part of his life and mirrors its ups and downs. Actually, sorry, Chris, may I just grab my water and this will, of course. Thank you very much. So what's going on in Humboldt? Georg Forster, famous as a writer and world traveler, journeys in 1790 with Humboldt through the Rhineland, England, and France. He notes that his travel companion has been haunted for years by sickness. And indeed, throughout his 20s, Humboldt documents in his letters reoccurring periods of physical pain, fever, shivers, body ache, and more. Long before the term neurasthenia is coined, Humboldt ascribes to himself Nervenschwäche, a weakness in his nerves. I have been constantly sick, he jots down in 1795. A few months later, Humboldt adds that he lives, quote, in a perpetual state of tension. Already Forster interprets Humboldt's physical issues as a psychosomatic reaction to the overemphasis on intellectual activity and his rigid education in Berlin. Humboldt mourns the early loss of his father, paints his mother as cold, and lacks emotional satisfaction in his youth. But way beyond his childhood and teenage years, he feels haunted, and again I'm quoting verbatim from his letters, by a feeling of loneliness, isolation, and melancholy, by being tossed around in his inner self, and by a pressure to disguise his inner being. Moreover, throughout this period, but hardly ever later in his life, Humboldt confesses the desire to be close to male companions, physically and intellectually. For any biographer, the emotional desires and sexual orientation of their subject are important. They frame how a life is lived, camouflaged or openly, fearful or with inner fulfillment, sociable or lonely, policed or rewarded by society. The many gray zones and colorful moments between these overly simple stereotypes are particularly interesting. But as so often, Humboldt does not fit neatly into any prescriptive category. There is his private correspondence's homoeroticism. Still, we don't know whether Humboldt experiences physical intimacy with male partners or lives it in his imagination only. He distances himself from this topic increasingly after 1800. Before then, he dreams of relationships with men who are hardly available as lovers, not to speak of the criminalization of homosexuality in the German lands. Humboldt feels unfulfilled regarding his sexual desires too. For sure, Humboldt's restless pace in the 1790s, his problems in finding his own identity, and his struggle to secure knowledge reflect the enormous turbulence of this decade. Historians are always interested in the interplay between individual life and societal context. And you all know this, or may even recall it for the non-historians from your 101 world history. lecture in your early years. The 1790s, of course, see regime changes, political transformations, military confrontations, wars, social eruptions in rapid succession. Just think of the revolutions in France and Haiti, where the first liberation of enslaved people happened while slavery continued to exist in Central and South America and in the new United States. Not forgetting the emergence of new political ideologies, still with fluid boundaries, not as hardcore as we sometimes think they were from the beginning: liberalism, conservatism, democracy, and so on. Not to forget also the signs of industrialization, new state formation, and more. It doesn't come as a surprise that many contemporaries got dizzy. Many despaired, others radicalized. Many lost their privileges, others gained freedom. Almost all felt that change and time were compressed, like in a pressure cooker, or to put it more elegantly with Goethe, events are crowded together. That's from Hermann und Dorothea, his epic poem. Humboldt's jumping between various subjects and roaming around in diverse knowledge areas are extreme, yet they were not entirely atypical for the epoch. They reflect the turmoil of a historical period that did not neatly demarcate scientific disciplines that were later professionalized. And Chris, in his introduction, actually referenced the issue of boundaries. A period that still lived off fluid transitions between scientific and non-scientific, and even between scientific and literary and aesthetic themes. Firm institutional and disciplinary structures incrementally replaced this fluidity in the 19th century. This is one of the reasons why Humboldt became more Humboldtian after 1800. Although the American journey is enormously strenuous, it also allows him to blend more forcefully comparative perspectives into his research, such as his planned geography and his thinking about global climate zones. His self-portrait of 1815 reflects in his kind of serious, very stern look, this newly gained discipline. After his return to Europe, Humboldt tries to systematically collect and interpret his findings and amend them with new data. He begins fact-checking, collating his dispersed observations, and yes, connecting the dots. But this endeavor remains an uphill battle until the end of his life. There's a letter in the, I think it's the early 1840s, where he said that he feels like being in a constant state of cosmic disorder, which is kind of a neat way to put his own confusion into words. As in the first third of his biography, Humboldt continues to bite off more than he can chew. He relies on support from others. Humboldtian science has always been a communal endeavor. Humboldt and his helpers need to classify thousands of botanical specimens, recognize new astronomical observations, weave into his text new insights from physics and chemistry, you name it. He can hardly catch up. Not unheard of today, isn't it? Plus, translating his American diaries and notes into travelogues and essays, such as on Mexico and Cuba, turns out to be tedious and costly. He's almost bankrupt at the end. Upon his return from his journey to Tsarist Russia and Central Asia in 1829, Humboldt concedes avant la lettre that Humboldtian science is necessary as a systematic, data-based, methodological sound exercise. But it cannot be achieved by one person alone, not even by him, as versatile, ambitious, and energetic as he is. In his address to the Petersburg Academy of Science, Humboldt calls for establishing a, quote, system of wisely combined observations pursued over a long period and conferred to savants established in their countries, end quote. Humboldt's extravagant idea, as he puts it in 1834, of, quote, describing in one and the same work the whole material world, from the nebulous stars to the mosses on the granite rocks, will lead to his late magnum opus Cosmos, published in his mid-70s and 80s. Yet that massive work, too, stays unfinished. So let's wrap things up. We are often eager to confirm that what we already assume about history's course and historical figures, forgetting that both are full of surprises. We slip, oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry for that. Thank you. We slip easily into the role of the Monday morning quarterback, pretending to know how a life, or a scientific project for that matter, unfolded because we know how it ended. Recall the two powerful images of the wise, monumental, all-knowing Humboldt, the author of Cosmos, we saw in the beginning. Yet a close look at Humboldt's early years demonstrates that his biography is less geared towards an end, his cosmic view of nature, than many maintain until today. Instead, it transformed and was full of contingencies. An enlightened biographical approach resists both heroizing and debunking its subject. It allows us to take seriously the contradictions and inconsistencies in an individual's life and thinking. In Humboldt's case, it allows us to see the discrepancies between his early studies and the meandering, impromptu style which he never fully shed, and what later generations have called Humboldtian science. Both aspects have their place in his life, though not always at the same time. Also, there are other notions associated with Humboldtian science. I don't have the time to address them in these 25 minutes, but I'm happy to comment on them during our Q&A. For example, the aesthetic notion in his work, or his drive to create publicity for everything he did, actually from his very first publications on. And this drive for publicity runs throughout his life. Moreover, there's always a mensch behind the monument. Personal features help explain modes of researching and collecting information. They belong together, be it in the case of Humboldt, Darwin, Oppenheimer, others, you name them. The personal and the individual, or the inner drives, as the historian and Clausewitz expert Peter Perret has put it, always go hand in hand with external motivations, outward-oriented interests, and research opportunities. Knowledge production and scientific research do not occur in a vacuum. They are contingent on specific historical contexts. That can be the political environment and its expectations, perceived economic necessities, or technological advancements. Humboldt's struggle with inaccuracies and incompleteness was and is more than an individual affair. Even today, or I should better say especially today in the age of AI, it is illusionary to assume that information gathering naturally leads to more objectivity, precision, or even truth. Three quite relative categories. Some of you may have read Yuval Noah Harari's new book, Nexus, in which he argues along these lines. Harari suggests that spreading information has historically helped forge human networks, and Humboldt would be an excellent example. It is therefore very apt that the Humboldt Foundation and its American friends bear the name of a man whose versatility remains unmatched. A man with an abundance of talents and a multitude of impressive results emerging from his research. A man who erred but retained the capacity to correct himself, a much undervalued virtue. A man, too, for whom research was never a linear process with foreseeable results, but often imbued with setbacks, struggles, and it went along detours. All these factors necessarily belong to any scientific inquiry. Even where we err, and we do it, of course, all the time, it is Humboldt's never-ending curiosity in his quest to continue pushing the boundaries of knowledge, as much as the Humboldtian ideal type we rightly use as guidance, that serves us well as an incentive in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
May I join you here?
Please.
Yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture and the impulses. I'm really grateful for the picture you painted for us of a fascinating, gifted individual who performed Humboldt science. I'm wondering, what were the driving forces when we look at not the history of the person, the individual, but rather the history of the memory of Humboldt? What were the driving forces that created that image of Humboldtian? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Let me first dive down one more time. Let me get my water. Thank you. Look, Humboldt was unique in, any individual is unique, but as in his potential to serve as a cultural hero, as a projection screen for everything, changing regimes in Germany and partially even in the United States, changing historical periods found worthwhile. He served extremely well. He got not entangled personally in any wars or revolutions. He stayed distant from many of the evils of contemporary society. He produced an immense knowledge. So what a man. And what we notice as historians is that over time, certainly in Germany, but again, also even in England, in the United States, contemporaries began to project what they thought was the best and the most valuable in modern science onto Humboldt, being interdisciplinary, connecting everything, being holistic, being comprehensive, digging deep and yet having a bird's eye view. So we have Humboldt as a vehicle in many cases for the desire of societies to invent heroes, to create intellectual traditions, to provide some intellectual glue for ever-changing societal needs. And just in passing, the monuments that I showed you, they were all erected after his death. 1876, Philadelphia, the World Exhibit, 1883, Berlin, 1892, Chicago could be added, and others. And in all of these cases, those worshiping him and those giving the money, sponsoring these monuments, were hoping to revive what they thought was his ideal lived in their own society. So an interesting process of embracing Humboldt and yet trying to rescue his individuality. And as you heard, I'm not arguing against using this trope Humboldtian science. I think it is appropriate for specific periods. It is appropriate even for us today. But it is, of course, our job as scholars to dig deeper and to investigate in what kind of relationship is there between these general, broad statements and the individual.
Well, that's also a relief for us as American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, because that tells me that we do not have to stop calling our alumni Humboldtians, right?
Absolutely.
That's very, very important for our brand. Before I want to open the floor and the online floor, so to speak, for questions, comments from the audience, maybe one more question, Andreas. You said it earlier, and that resonated very well with me. These are my words now. I hope I got you correctly. That you neither, with your work, you neither want to put Humboldt on a pedestal, nor do you intend to tear one down or tear him down from there. So you're interested in the nuances and the facts on Humboldt. That would be my interpretation. In this framework, what, from your opinion, would be his relevance today, his relevance when it comes to, again, mentioned this earlier in my opening remarks, the global challenges we deal with, many of those were not there. Some were already, but many of those were not there at his time. He didn't have to worry about AI governance, for example. But what would you say is the relevance of the historical figure, again, the gifted individual who was jumping from theme to theme, topic to topic, who was internationally versed, for our work today, where we try to make contributions under the label of Humboldt and Humboldtian to solving the big, or contributing to solving the big challenges humanity is facing now, such as global warming, public health, AI governance, and so forth?
It's a great question. I think there is actually quite a list of achievements of Humboldt that are not founded, ironically, in the results of his research, but in the way he strove for them and the way he thought and wanted to go for something broader and bigger. So one thing I think we definitely need in the 21st century is a mixture of curiosity and critical distance. He went into the archives in Mexico. He collected indigenous scriptures to bring them to his brother in Rome. So he was someone who always, in spite of all the Eurocentrism inherent in his person and in his work, always kept an open eye. He may not have gone as far as we wish today in his, for example, critique of colonialism, but nevertheless, he didn't stop where he was. So curiosity combined with critical distance is one thing. Another feature of his that I think we truly need, and you mentioned the global climate crisis, is indeed to look globally at the world, to look in a comparative perspective. And many of you have probably seen his isothermal mapping of the world. He built on predecessors, yes, and nevertheless, it allows us to see South Asia and areas of America and the Mediterranean, not in a vertical, not in a hierarchical order, but in a horizontal and a global order. So being global and being comparative, I think, is something we do need in the 21st century. And just one final point before we collect more questions: publicity. Yes, Humboldt wanted public, today we call it discourses. He wanted public discussions, and he wanted the youngest generation to be in these public discussions. He promoted people we would call in today's world outsider or peripheral, people with no real record. Harari uses the term fringe people, which I don't really find appropriate. But he said we need to appreciate everyone and bring these people into, give them a public platform for their whatever, astronomical, climate research, for their physical experiments, regardless of background, religion, social status. So publicity combined with an eye on the rejuvenalization of society and of science, I think that too is something. And of course, the Humboldt Foundation is a trendsetter in this by devoting itself to promoting scientists regardless of background and of all ages and stages in their career.
Thank you. Do we have a handheld mic? Wonderful.
We do.
Any questions from the audience? Eric, please.
Thank you for that very good lecture. Very, very much enjoyed it. I don't know if this is on, but it's on. Great. Actually, it was the slide that was just blinking at me. And I was just very curious, a very small question. When it says beyond the Monday morning quarterback view, I was just curious because your German is probably a lot better than mine is. What a German person would say in place of Monday morning quarterbacking. I'm just very curious about that.
Der Besserwisser. I don't know, since Germans are not that much, it's changing currently, but not that much into football. I don't even know whether the expression is known in Germany, but it's someone who knows it better after the fact, of course. I don't know whether there is a German equivalent for that. Im Nachhinein es besser zu wissen. Yeah, that's.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have questions from our online audience?
Yes, we do. One from Professor Robert Frakes. Darwin took Humboldt's travel account with him on the Beagle, together with works by Lyell, Malthus, and some others. Do we know which books Humboldt took with him on his expedition?
That's a challenging question, because we know what he had read by the time he departed for the Americas. He adored Georg Forster, primarily because of Forster's travelogue on the world travel with James Cook. He read extensively, with some caveats, as I mentioned. He didn't sometimes have the stamina to to go all the way to the end. He read travelogues, he read, of course, scientific treatises. And since he was bilingual, he had an easy time reading in French, not only French and German, but Latin, of course. He was then fluent in English and in Spanish. I don't know exactly what books he literally took with him on the Pizarro, on the boat across the Atlantic. But I can tell you that during his travel in South America, he received notes and he sent letters. And he didn't enter a terra incognita. There were wonderful libraries in Central and South America, either private libraries by Creole scientists, or in Mexico City, an abundance of material, so Humboldt could catch up. Just although the question was more about Humboldt than about Darwin, just a tiny note on Darwin and Humboldt. We need to be very, very careful and not extrapolating from Darwin taking Humboldt's, some of Humboldt's stuff on his trip to Humboldt supposedly influencing Darwin and being a predecessor of evolutionary theory. He was not. But that's a big topic and it's disputed, and there's a new wave of interpreting. Some of you may have read Andrea Wolf's book, The Invention of Nature, where she makes this point and turns Humboldt into a predecessor of Darwin. That is certainly questionable. And a few years ago, I had the chance to look at the Darwin papers and some of the original Darwin books, actually, and where he jotted down occasionally notes on Humboldt. And at some point, there is a line where he says, there's nothing on evolution in Humboldt. So you open a box that leads to all kinds of other issues, but reading didn't stop, certainly, once he left La Coruña and went across the Atlantic.
As far as we know, this restless and endless accumulation of knowledge, did he expect, or was he aware, or did he try to influence political events and developments, or was that not a driving force of his accumulation of knowledge?
It's a wonderful question. Look, Humboldt lived in the age of Atlantic revolutions. I mean, everything is happening. The storming of the Bastille, the beheading of the French king, the reign of terror, revolutions in not only in Central America, the liberation movement, independence movement, but 1830, 1848. So he's relatively close to all these events. And the older he gets, the more he's drawn kind of into the events by virtue of being in the entourage of the Prussian king. So the man is there. But it's interesting that he doesn't define himself as a participant. He defines himself as an observer. And he comments primarily behind the scenes. He never goes public in his political views. He's meandering between these different positions. He's friends with people whom contemporary despise as arch-conservative, as well as with Democrats, or what contemporary called Democrats and liberals. But he never takes a firm position in political matters. However, in analyzing societies, such as the Spanish colonial empire, he's not naive. And he notices that political imperatives and military imperatives have an enormous and often destructive impact on, for example, societies in Central and South America. He knows that, and he writes it. He says the system of imperial conquest was exploitative. It was brutal. It was inhuman. But he would never go as far as, for example, putting his name on the banner of abolitionism. So we have a man who was tries to keep a distance by recognizing that science and politics are not two independent entities. They are reciprocal often in their impact on society, and that he jots down in his analyses of these societies. So if you are interested in these kinds of aspects, his essay on Cuba and on Mexico is very interesting. And during COVID, actually, it was interesting. The Spanish colonial empire had a lot of issues that we are facing again in the 21st century: pandemics and viruses and carriers of diseases. The biggest enemy of the Spaniards in the Americas was the mosquito. Tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers died. So medicine, politics, military conquest were always intertwined. And then Humboldt comes and reads about these stories, and he kind of intervenes, at least in an intellectual way, by saying, well, should we now burn down the city because it was infected? Or should we dry it out? Should we improve water supply? What can we do against mosquitoes? So in a very distant and intellectual, scholarly way, he does address then semi-political and political issues. Thank you, Uli.
We have one more question from our virtual audience. Thank you for your excellent talk exploring the less known aspects of AVH's life and legacy. In your view, would you envision Humboldt channeling or converging his various interests into the modern day role of a science diplomat? And that question comes from Cecilia Flacco.
It's a hypothetical question, and it's a counterfactual question, and as such, extremely valuable. I think, we are in Nietzschean terms, as historians, we don't want to be antiquarian and just collect and kind of reproduce what the sources supposedly tell us. We are appropriating subjects for today's world and reflect upon them. So the question of what would he have done in today's world, I think it's, although hypothetical, it's actually very valuable. I think he would have, first of all, greatly appreciated Google. So because he could have looked up all the specimens and the names and all these things. He would have enormously appreciated digitalization of materials because, look, he needed to travel to Rome to go to the Vatican archives and to the most obscure places, that's not Rome, to dig out materials. And of course, he would have enjoyed all that. I would be careful in putting him, and be it only in a fictional, hypothetical way, into the role of a science diplomat. Because if you do that, you need to ask, what's the subject? What's the theme? What's the agenda of science diplomats? Is it science or is it politics mediated by scientists? And if so, he did it on both levels in a very mediated way, for example, by creating very dense networks among scholars, German, Franco relations, but also with Mexican scholars, with American scholars. A lot of American scholars flocked to Berlin in his later years. So on that level, he may be called a diplomat, but it was hardly ever for political ends.
I very much appreciated the two sides that you created here of Humboldt himself, and then the projections that people made of Humboldt, that it's not just Humboldt, but it's who we need. And I'm interested in, not just how he would have acted today, but how he would have critiqued the projection. And that's of course what your talk is about, how Humboldtian is he, and also what he would have made of Harari. Of course, the fact that he becomes the story that people then latch onto and find some guidance by. I'd be very interested in. Well, that's pure speculation about what he might think of Harari, but the whole idea about the role of stories for humankind, for collaboration and collectivity.
For those who couldn't see the person who raised the question, Professor Nathan Stoltz, who's a very distinguished colleague and historian, wrote many wonderful books, among others, on the Rosenstrasse and resistance in the Third Reich. So, which is also a rediscovery of a narrative, I think, that we have forgotten about. Yes, Humboldt was cognizant of the fact that his life and everything he does, and he became really a public persona. I mean, everyone knew him, not only in Berlin, but in Philadelphia, in Paris, in London, in Madrid, and if not in person, then through his writings. So he was very cognizant of the fact that he was stuff for stories. And knowing that, that's my first answer, he fueled these stories. He was a co-author of the narrative that existed at his time. For example, during his American journey, smart as he was, he sent notes back to Europe and had them published in journals and things. So he wanted the European public to know he's there, he's out there, he's doing serious work. And he's not only the adventurer, the kind of the guy who buries himself in dust and dirt to protect himself from mosquitoes. He's really doing serious work. That's part of the narrative. He is, secondly, vain, as we all are. I mean, who is not vain? Who would not enjoy publicity for their own work? So he enjoys his success. He enjoys being flattered. He's a great conversationalist. But he's ironic enough and sometimes cynical enough to know that this is a means to achieve ends. For example, to be, flattered by the Prussian king or by whatever, to gain some support for other scholars he wanted to support. Did he ever distance himself? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. He, especially in his 70s and 80s coincide with the 1840s and 1850s. So he's world renowned. And some call him an abolitionist, some call him an opportunist, some call him, say he's too close to the Prussian king. Others say he's a friend of the Democrats. And Humboldt often lets it go. He doesn't intervene. But there are instances where he says it's enough projections. Once in a while he publishes a note on issues he wants to set the record straight, and in his many correspondences that we have, thousands of letters, actually many published, he's very candid and frank in his exchange with other scholars about setting the record straight and not letting anyone project anything onto him. Of course, he then passes away in 1859, coincides with the year the German public celebrates Friedrich Schiller, so another cultural hero. And that's an interesting year because now many people in Germany actually elevate Humboldt. So he's being positioned next to Schiller. What a guy, what an icon, what a hero. He doesn't, after all, he lives almost 90 years, so way longer than contemporaries did in the early 19th century. That he couldn't influence any longer. But the storytelling surrounding Humboldt that then unfolded after his death has been the topic of a book that I've profited a lot from, Nicholas Rupke's meta-biography of Humboldt, in which he tells exactly the story of the narratives that appropriated Alexander. Thank you, Nathan.
I apologize, I came in late, so if you've already talked about this, please just say so. But when you talk about how he lived into the 1850s, 1860s, I'm curious. 1850s. I'm curious if he had any interaction with the narratives of nationalism that were growing then, and I could see how someone so involved in classifications of nature would find that in some ways congenial. Nationalism is, of course, in the modern form associated with nationalism as an ideology, as resulting or leading potentially to a nation state with boundaries and
and systems of governance is a fairly modern phenomenon. Historians quarrel where the origins are, but leaving that aside, it's fair to say that since the French Revolution, the issue is on the agenda. And often competition with a neighbor, take France and Germany, which doesn't exist at the time, leads to an awakening of nationalism as an ideology, as a feeling of belonging that is actively being construed. So Humboldt notices that. He notices that not only in Prussia, and because he's in Berlin, he's back in Berlin when the Napoleon Wars enter, the conquests enter Prussian territory, and of course further east then, and he's very, very distant to exactly the kind of nationalization that you are indirectly referencing. He is not in favor of defining, other than his brother William, by the way, not in favor of now thinking a lot about a state or a German state or what the German nation is, which is, of course, one of the topic number ones around 1800 and into the so-called liberation wars. And he stays away from that. Part of that is grounded in his kind of enlightened cosmopolitanism. Part of that is grounded in his fear of revolution, in his fear of turmoil, in his fear of regime changes. He was maybe not always politically in our current terminology, but emotionally conservative. He didn't like rapid changes and violent changes. Having said that, his take on the on nationalism, on nation building processes in South America is again different. He is not promoting it actively. That's a myth in itself, another narrative. He is not, he knows Bolivar and he follows these events, but all these events in the independence movements, of course, happen after his return from the Americas, but he welcomes these developments. He says these people deserve independence. This was an unjust colonial system, but he would never go as far as saying this is indicative of our need as a society to define ourselves as nations, to erect borders. So in that sense, his older cosmopolitanism merges with what we may call a form of transnationalism. Chris again said it in his introduction. Borders need to be respected, but we need to find vehicles and ways to overcome them. A great question.
We have one more question from the online audience.
Sure, a couple of short ones.
Wonderful.
First from Craig Johnson, what research did Humboldt emphasize in his elder years? And then from Elizabeth Lush Quinn, to what do you attribute Humboldt's passion for detail of any of and all apparent varieties of certain kinds of observational descriptive knowledge? Did he ever worry about its limits and where this impulse could lead for the human person in the absence of a sense of intellectual humility? And is there any indication that he was familiar with Goethe's Faust?
With whose stuff?
Faust.
Goethe's Faust. Yes, I start with I start with some of the ingredients of this long question, which is very, very good, and I appreciate this. So thank you. First of all, he had read Goethe, and he read especially the early works of Goethe, or earlier works, so before 1800. He also met Goethe, of course, several times in his life, and Goethe sent him things, and vice versa. By the way, Humboldt pops up in the Wahlverwandtschaften in a little bit of an ironic way. Has to do also with details. So if you want to look that up. I am not aware, but I'm happy to research it and email you if you send me an email, whether he commented on Goethe's Faust. That I don't know, but I think he was very much aware of the figure of the Zauberlehrling and the pots we open and cannot master and what comes out of that. I think the first part of your question was about details, if I understand it correctly, and whether he got lost in them or was aware that detail orientation may prevent him from gaining the bigger picture. If that was your question, I apologize if it wasn't. So yes, he was very much aware that he got overly entangled in details, that he was at times excessively empiricist or positivistic, and that of course contradicts everything we normally say about Humboldt being holistic and visionary and cosmic. But he could not let loose, and it is also admirable that he really went to enormous length, and with that I transition towards the first question, in soliciting ever more details in the last 20 years of his life, measuring this or that, or an observation made in 1816, how would that be in 1834, light, atmospheric quality of the atmosphere, certain animals that he had encountered, and so on and so forth. So during his later years, I think that was the first question, he's trying to put bits and pieces together. So on the one hand side, this data collecting goes on, but then it is super interesting to see that he ventures again into new areas. For example, landscape painting. He becomes friends with some landscape painters, Hildebrand and others, and he studies the history of the aesthetic depiction of nature since basically Petrarch and the Renaissance. And if you look in the later Cosmos volumes, there's one devoted to these things. So he doesn't get stuck in the past. But then again, and that that's what makes Humboldt so fascinating. Towards the end of the life, he comes back to certain issues he had encountered, of all places, in Franconia, in his little mining districts, currency value, gold value, or digging a canal. The Panama Canal bothered him. That it didn't exist, obviously, at the time, but he was wondering, why don't we get to the point that when we can connect the Pacific and the Atlantic? Mining is still an issue that follows him. The efficiency of resource exploitation is an issue that resurfaces in his later life. So he's all over, and in the end, he cannot anymore. And he publishes a note in the, I think the Berliner Zeitung or newspaper, one of the Berliner newspapers, and saying, please don't send me any longer letters and requests and inquiries. I'm an old man, I need a break. And then several months later, he gets his break forever.
Well, Andreas, before we invite everybody who's here some snacks and drinks to continue the conversation, I want to ask you one last question. Take the privilege to ask the last question. Whenever I go to events, in my role as president and CEO of American Friends of the Humboldt Foundation, go to events in Washington, D.C., receptions, very often at embassies. I find, especially when I go to, when I get invitations to embassies from Latin American, from South American countries, the moment I show my business card, or the moment I identify myself as an employee of an organization connected with Humboldt, there's always resonance. And it's always a great conversation starter. That is not happening when I'm in Germany. Why is that?
Well, you meet the wrong people in Germany.
Good answer.
Look, Chris, you're living here on call it one huge continent or two continents, North and South America, in which Humboldt resonated like no other non-American scientist. I think the only other person who resonated as widely in the Americas, both North and South, or let's say North, are maybe people like Darwin or Churchill. It's not a very different personality. The point being that I think for both Americas, for different reasons, audiences throughout the ages respected Humboldt for what they thought he gave him, and he gave them a lot of stuff to understand the fauna and flora and the river system of South America. A lot of stuff that fed into the New England transcendentalists' thinking about, up to Thoreau and John Moore, who were kind of Humboldtian, if you want to put it like that. And I think this history of a very multifaceted receptiveness to Humboldt is perhaps didn't exist in Germany, or it doesn't exist until today. Maybe also because of Germany's complicated history with a lot of breaks and ruptures. But you know, I mean, in Germany, Humboldt, of course, Alexander, has a fierce competition. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, there's Wilhelm, there's Goethe, there's Schiller, there are all the other guys, and then in the 20th century, the physicists. So he's not alone. But what made, I think, Humboldt attractive and still makes him attractive, and I'm very happy living on this continent, hearing about your experience, is that he was, and we didn't even talk today, now we are running out of time, about the post-colonial critique, which is, I think, necessary and appropriate in many, many ways. But also we need to put it into perspectives. And the point I want to make is, ultimately, he was not complicit in active colonization. He was not complicit in enslavement of people. There are thousands of contradictions in his life, including in regard to that. But he was someone who, in his distance, could still and can still be referenced. And I think that's an asset to cherish.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you very much to our online audience for the great questions. Please register again when we do the next New Perspectives on Humboldt installment in 2025. Thank you very much for everybody here at our office. And of course, thank you so much. And please join me again. And let's give Andreas a hand for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And now, bon appetit and Prost, I'd say.
You were very